Hi, welcome to part two of Addiction 101 for family members. I'm Tom Harrison. I'm the author of The Complete Family Guide to Addiction. Today we're going to be talking about what's going on in the brain of an addicted person. What's going on in their head such that they behave in the incredibly confounding and self-destructive ways that they do. Well, to start, all of us have in our brain what we'll call a pleasure and reward system. Now that sounds funny, right? We have a circulatory system and a respiratory system. We also have a pleasure system. And that sounds odd, but it actually has a very important evolutionary function. Because when you do something that's good for you or good for the species, evolution wants to tell you that's good, keep doing that. And the way it accomplishes that is that it enables you to experience pleasure. So you eat a good meal, you are successful at work, you have sex, you do something altruistic, you get exercise, and your body says that's good for the species, keep doing that, here's some pleasure. Now, at a chemical level, what's happening when you experience pleasure is that a neurotransmitter called dopamine is being released in a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, sometimes called the pleasure center of the brain. Now, all drugs of addiction, all substances of addiction, they have many different side effects. Alcohol is different from cocaine, is different from heroin, is different from methamphetamine, but they all have one thing in common, which is they stimulate the production of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Now, in people who are susceptible to addiction, and in the next segment we'll talk about why some people are susceptible and others are not. But in people who are susceptible, they take the drug, they keep taking the drug, they keep taking the drug, they keep stimulating more and more dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Now, the brain reacts to that. Okay, the brain always seeks equilibrium, and it says, wait a minute, there's a whole lot of dopamine here. I didn't do that. What's going on? And it tries to regulate the amount of dopamine. And it does this in two ways. The first way is it reduces the number of dopamine receptors in the brain. It reduces the ability of dopamine to create pleasure. And what that means, if you're an addicted person, is that you have to take more and more of the drug to get the same effect, to get the same amount of pleasure. And we call this developing a tolerance. Right? You have to take more and more to get the same effect. That's because your number of dopamine receptors is being reduced. The second thing the brain does is it produces less and less dopamine in response to normal stimuli. So the things in your life that normally give you pleasure, eating a good meal, going for a walk, spending time with your family, your favorite sports team wins the big game, all of these things suddenly stop providing you any pleasure. They're not enjoyable. The only thing that's producing any pleasure in your life after a while is the substance. And even that substance is producing less and less and less pleasure. So you eventually reach a point where you don't have any pleasure in your life or any meaning in your life other than from this substance. And even this substance is not really giving you any enjoyment. You just have this horrendous, constant craving that needs to be relieved with the substance. And that's the horror, the end game of addiction. Now, while this is happening in the nucleus accumbens, a couple other parts of the brain are also being affected. One of these is the amygdala. Now, among other things, it does a number of things, but among other things, the amygdala is like the radar center of the brain. It scans the environment and it says what's important and what's not. And over time, in the addicted person, the amygdala begins to focus more and more and ultimately exclusively on finding drugs and using drugs. Those become the only things that the brain is focused on. Another part of the brain that's affected is the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is the decision-making part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that weighs costs and benefits and makes a decision. And over time, this part of the brain becomes impaired by what's happening elsewhere. And the decision making becomes affected such that using drugs, finding drugs, takes on tremendous importance. It's as though you have a scale, but there's a huge unfair weight on the benefit side. The drugs always win. So the person says, should I go to work or should I take drugs? More important to take drugs. Should I look after my child or take drugs? More important to take drugs. People start making decisions that they would never make in their regular life if their brain wasn't hijacked by this disease process. So that's what's happening in the brain. That's how the person slides down into this condition where they only think about finding drugs and using drugs. Everything else is unimportant. And that's why you can't reason with an addict. You can't say, hey, look, can't you see that the costs are outweighing the benefits of your behavior? Because the part of their brain that makes that judgment is making a judgment. They think they're acting on the basis of what's most important. It's just that their ability to judge what's most important is completely out of whack. Now, why does this happen to some people and not to other people? Why do some people get addicted and they don't? Others don't. And we'll talk about that in our next section, part 3. Hope you'll join me for that. Thank you.